Poker is not a solved game. It never has been, and it never will be. We're about to analyze a hand where you could literally sit there with the solver, follow every single step that it tells you, and still get the hand completely wrong. This hand between Doug Polk and LSG Hank takes place at Hustler Casino in a high stakes poker environment. Doug is, of course, the GTO wizard, and LSG Hank turns out to be a little bit of a psycho. What happens when the wizard meets the psycho? This is the hand where GTO proves to not be quite enough. So here we are at Hustler Casino. They're playing the stand-up game currently, which is designed to create a bunch of action. Basically, the last player to win a hand has to pay the rest of the table $6,000. So there's high incentive to get involved in pots. That may be what ultimately influences this hand a little bit, although the hand winds up playing pretty close to theory until the very end. So Tom Dwan limps from early position with 10 deuce suited. Don't try this at home, especially if you've already won a hand in the stand-up game like Tom did. He has a dot next to his name, so no real need to get involved with a hand like this from early. LSG Hank raises it up to 6K, pretty standard with ace jack suited. And then Doug comes in with a large 5x 3 bet to 30K. Normally, this would be a lot larger than we would expect, but they are so deep right now. They're about 1,000 big blinds deep, each of them having over 1 million in chips. So three betting to a larger size when you're this deep is totally fine. Um, Tom gets out of the way as we'd expect with his garbage hand, and LSG Hank, he's got 24K to make the call. He's got a really good hand, especially in the stand-up game. This is basically like a premium hand. It's going to fare better by calling than four betting because he would potentially open himself up to a five bet, which could be quite miserable in this environment, not knowing really what to do here. But he decides to just call, pretty standard here, and we go to the flop. The flop is Queen of Hearts, four of diamonds, three of clubs. Pretty dry, disconnected board. Doug has the range advantage here. Of course, he's going to have kings and aces, maybe even queens too, where LSG Hank probably doesn't have any of those hands except for potentially queens some of the time. And so Doug enjoys a range advantage. This allows Doug to bet at a pretty high frequency with the majority of his range. He goes 23K, so roughly one third pot. Totally solver approved. Nothing wrong with this bet. And LSG Hank with an overcard, backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw. First, a bet of this size, he has to defend three-quarters of his range. He's definitely in the top three quarters with the backdoor equity, with position. This is a totally standard call, and he does make it. He doesn't know that he only has 7% equity here, guys. So in real time, his play is quite reasonable. So he makes the call, and we have 111K in the pot, and we go to the turn, which is the 8 of diamonds. And now Doug has a few different lines he could go. They're still quite deep, so Doug needs to be a little bit careful with his strong one pair holdings and stick to a pretty polar strategy here. This card is mostly, for all intents and purposes, a blank, unless LSG Hank happened to have pocket eights. Really nothing from his flop calling range has now improved to beat Doug's pocket aces in the range. But with that said, if Doug faces a turn raise here, because of the stack depths involved, this is going to be a very hard hand for Doug to play. His hand isn't quite strong enough in most cases to stack off for 1,000 big blinds or $1 million with just one pair. So he is opening himself up to this type of play. With that said, it's totally fine to continue here. Solver likes going more like one half pot. So this is where the only real spot where Doug deviates from theory is going a little bit bigger than approved. He winds up going more like three-quarters pot. He goes 80K into the 111K. Not totally an unused line by the solver, just a little bit less frequent. And that doesn't make it it doesn't make it a wrong play. It's just a little bit less common, and it's opening himself up to a little bit more risk. So he opens, he winds up betting 81K, and LSG Hank has now picked up the nut flush draw. And so he's definitely not going to be folding here. His only two options really are to call or to raise. And raising and facing potentially a jam by Doug and getting blown off his equity would be pretty disastrous. he does have position, so he can realize his equity quite well. He can get paid off quite often on the river if he does make his flush. So he does not know that his ace is not an out here and that his jack is not an out. So in real time, he may have been counting some of those as outs and continuing here. But even just with his nut flush draw and the implied odds, the massive amount of stack that's left behind, his call is totally fine. And he does decide to make it. So this is where the hand really goes off the rails. So we get the 9 of hearts river, and action is on Doug. And Doug has a big decision. He normally will bet this hand, although typically he would not want to size super large. However, most of his range, if we think about it, is things like aces, kings, ace, queen. It's things that don't necessarily want to bet huge and then have to like bet fold to a river jam and be put in like a really awkward spot. He has things like jack 10 of diamonds, of course. He could have pocket eights in his range, but the reality is Doug does not have that many nutted hands here. He mostly has like the pretty good variety in his range. And usually when that's the case, in theory, we're supposed to do a little bit more checking and a little bit more small betting. So Doug chooses a size that it's not like out of bounds for theory in any way. He does go 200K, still an accepted play, but when he is jammed on, it makes life absolutely miserable. So Doug is hoping that essentially this bet will just be called by a queen, and he'll make a really nice payday off the hand. The problem is he probably wouldn't bet this large with queens if he was holding pocket queens. So already a big portion of his nutted range is not going this size. When that's the case, he really can't go this size with his like pretty good but not great stuff, because now all of a sudden he's not backed up by the nutted stuff that will frighten LSG Hank from raising all in on a jam. Seems like LSG Hank picked this up on some level, probably figured that Doug isn't going this size all throughout with queens. Queens would probably bet a little bit smaller in the sense that he wants to capture value from queen X. Can't go super big if you have 2 queens in your hand because now opponent doesn't have a lot of queen X. Also, LSG Hank has the jack of diamonds in his hand, which is pretty relevant here. It means Doug cannot have jack 10 of diamonds. So in this moment, LSG Hank decides, well, guy probably doesn't have queens, probably doesn't have a straight either. I'm going all in. He risks 937K and sends Doug immediately into the tank. You can see that Doug is sick to his stomach, doesn't know what to do. And this is the problem when basically we have a hand that doesn't want to play for stacks, but we're basically hammering away with it for 3 streets. We end up in kind of this no man's land that is tough to deal with. Now, Doug is not allowed to just fold all his bluff catchers here. Hands like aces, kings, ace, queen, they do need to call some of the time, or else he's just bet folding this river way, way, way too often. But what is the right frequency? How does Doug make the decision? Doug winds up randomizing, which is actually quite clever. And it's one of the craziest things. The solver actually likes Doug calling with aces specifically about 1/4 of the time. So Doug randomizes. He basically does this like 4-card randomizer. And if it turns out that one of the 4 leads to the call, he will abide by that and let it be binding. And so it turns out that the combination of aces that is picked is the fold combination. Doug does make the fold, and we'll see in a second that LSG Hank is going to react with absolute glee. Yeah, well, there it is. So he reacts with absolute glee. He realizes he gets the bluff through. And the question is, what do we do with a hand like this? From a theory point of view, Doug actually played the hand completely standard. He followed the book to a T, including the randomization at the end, mind you, where he basically does what the solver wants him to do, which is to 1/4 of the time, like call with this hand, 3/4 of the time fold, and basically become like this objective machine. Even as he does all that, it's still not enough to come to the right play in this spot. So how do we process it? Well, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback Doug's play, but The reality is he followed book almost to a T, and it just backfired on him. Well, we can think in terms of long term, right? We can always remember that this is just one of, thousands of hands that Doug is going to play. If Doug plays this strategy 1,000 times, it's going to be very hard to exploit him because he does have enough strong hands to call with here. He could call with his pocket eights. He could call with his jack 10 of diamonds. He could sometimes call with, aces, kings when the randomization works out in his favor. So he's not always going to be folding here, and he can't really be exploited. But that said, it doesn't really make you feel all that much better in the moment when something like this happens to you. A lot of players know that feeling. They have this type of hand repeat in their heads over and over and over again that they could have done something different and just didn't, and it cost them all sorts of money. Mentally, that's how it feels. The reality is, once LSG Hank jams for this amount of money, Doug's hand is reduced to a 0 EV hand. The solver agrees. If you're holding a hand like aces, kings, ace, queen, one of these, one pair bluff catchers here, you have now been reduced to 0 expected value, whether you call or you fold, which is, of course, 0 expected value. If you are a good long-term winning poker player, the reality is that your profit does not come primarily from these 0 EV spots. These are the spots that torture us more than anything in poker, but they are not the spots where you're going to make your killing over the long run. These are the spots to simply do your best, recognize that you're in unfamiliar territory, recognize that sometimes you do need to call down with this portion of your range to keep your opponent honest. And if it happens to be wrong or you happen to fold incorrectly, try your best not to let it get to you moving into the next hand, recognizing that this type of spot is not where your profit comes from, especially when LSG Hank risks this much money. LSG Hank is risking 2 times the pot. So basically, Doug only needs to call about 1/3 of the time in order to keep him honest. So Doug gets to call with the top 1/3 of hands that he would be betting in this spot. Aces is really like, it might be in that top 1/3, but it's actually like not at the very top. It's like sort of towards the bottom of the acceptable 1/3 range. Therefore, he's not giving up too much by folding this hand. He has better hands in his range to call with. Of course, his sets, his 2 pair 8-9 suited, his straight jack 10 suited. He has things in here that can call instead of aces. Meanwhile, LSG Hank needs this play to work 66% of the time. He better be really confident that it's going to work that often to be risking this much money, because it's just going to be that much more expensive if Doug is even calling half the time. If that's what happens, LSG Hank is winning the 437K pot half the time, but he's losing his 937K bluff half the time. Across the 2 trials, he's losing about 500K, so about 250K on average every time he makes this play. It's not a profitable play if Doug is calling that often. So he really has to be sure that Doug is going to overfold the spot, not call more than 1/3 of the time. And so I think Doug would not be overfolding the spot. Doug is very theoretically well-versed player. Solver doesn't approve. Solver prefers that you have a pair in your hand plus a straight blocker. That is not the case here. He blocks all of Doug's flush draw bluffs. The one blocker that he has is a straight blocker with jack 10 of diamonds, but Doug can easily have the other jack 10 combos as well. So we would rather actually see LSG Hank turn a hand like queen 10 suited into a bluff here, or queen jack suited, because he'd be blocking Doug's set of queens in addition to blocking the straight. It's a little bit risky to be doing it with this particular combo in theory. But that said, this is why poker is not solved. Guys, we have a hand where Doug played almost according to theory, by the book. LSG Hank deviates from theory completely. This is not a bluff in theory at all. So does that argue that this is just a one-time lucky fluke hand? Maybe. Or it could argue that this is one of these spots where theory and logic are not quite enough to win the poker game. Theory and logic are just one piece of the puzzle. And ultimately, LSG Hank went with an intuition in the moment and went with his read. Give him credit. Even if we had a solver wide open, the solver would be telling to Doug to call at a certain frequency with his particular hand. How does he ultimately make that decision? It's based on intuition. It's based on feeling. It's based on what is going on in this particular moment. There is still individual discretion involved in the hand, and we have to recognize that in addition to all the other theoretical play that is going on. So a beautiful hand, honestly, from both players. I thought Doug played the hand quite well. Maybe he could have used a slightly smaller sizing to not put as much of his stack at risk and open himself up to this type of play. But he was playing a theoretically sound strategy, and another player just outplayed him. And sometimes great offense beats good defense. I think that's what we ultimately saw in this hand. So thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you recognize that even if you had the perfect solver strategy, the way that Doug appeared to have it in this hand, it's still sometimes not enough. And ultimately, hands can come down to crazy intuitions and crazy moves just like this.